Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Richard Edwards. I'm a co-director of Aspire2025, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar here in the medical school today. So I'd like to thank everyone who's come along today. I'll introduce Frank in just a moment. I would just say we've also got a sort of video link, or whatever you call it, people coming in from afar. So there's a few people just to mention who are also beaming in from various places. So we've got Angela Waru and Alice Walker from Auckland and Bay of Plenty DHBs respectively, Sala Dara from Heart Foundation, Bridget Forsyth from the Cancer Society and Vicky Ambrose from the Cancer Society here, and Vicky Forsyth from Cancer Society Southland. We've got Carrot Graham from Facilitate, Stacey Edwards from University of Otago, and Nadia Martin from the University of Waterloo, Ontario. So welcome Nadia in particular. And we may get one or two others who come in later. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Frank, who's it's a great pleasure to host him here today. He's been very busy today, very, very busy. And many of you may have heard him on various radio stations and TV programs and so on. So Frank is a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which is also the Windy City, I think. And he's the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center on the Economics of Tobacco Control. He's got numerous awards in tobacco control, such as the Luther Terry Award, which is for exemplary leadership in tobacco control and outstanding research contribution, and that's a very, very major award. He's got the John Slade Award from the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, and many others. Frank is really one of the world-leading experts on tobacco taxation, so it really is wonderful to have him here today. And one of the first tobacco control books I read was Tobacco Control in Developing Countries, which Frank, I think, co-edited with Prabhan, which is a fabulous book, and that's one of the things that really got me inspired into tobacco control.
So thanks very much, Richard, and thanks for having me down. This is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for everybody coming out to hear about one of my favorite topics. I love to talk about tobacco tax. I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing on a Friday afternoon than talking about tobacco taxes. So I'm going to share a little bit of the work that we've been doing recently in the U.S. So we have a variety of different projects going on, some that are very focused on the U.S., some that are very focused on what's happening internationally. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the research that we're doing. I'm going to try to cover some of the work that we're doing on tobacco tax structures. So how governments tax tobacco tends to be much more important than I realized a few years ago in terms of how those taxes impact tobacco use. I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing on price elasticity of cigarette demand, and I'll explain what all that is when we get there for the non-economists. Talk about the work that we're doing around other tobacco products, which have largely been ignored in the economics work to date. Which will then segue into e-cigarette demand and some of the things that I'm thinking about there, especially around how to tax electronic cigarettes and some of the other alternative nicotine products that are coming to markets. And then close with a bit of a discussion about where I think some of this research could help New Zealand in terms of where things are going here. I am fortunate to work with a number of really good people. So this is just a partial list of the collaborators that have contributed to the work that I'm doing. But again, over the last 30 years, I've had hundreds of really wonderful colleagues, and our work is supported by all sorts of different funders. So a lot of the big U.S. funders, some of the big global funders in tobacco control. So again, I always like to start my talks with my favorite all-time quotes. Adam Smith, how many people know who Adam Smith is? Yeah, so Adam Smith is the founder of modern economics. This is from his book, The Wealth of Nations. 240 years ago almost, and he pretty much defined what I've spent my life doing. So he said back in 1776, sugar, rum, and tobacco are commodities which are nowhere necessaries of life, which are become objects of almost universal consumption, and which are therefore extremely proper subjects of taxation. So I've been working on tax for 30 years on tobacco. I've also done a lot of work on alcohol tax. And in the last few years, we've gotten into things like sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. So really thinking about how we can use tax to promote public health. This is just a handful of some of the things that I'll be drawing on. So I've done a lot of different work with WHO, with the World Bank, with the International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project, the ITC project. So a lot of this is going to feed into some of what I talk about this afternoon. So again, tax structure is something that I think has not gotten the attention that it has needed. This is something that we've come to realize is really important. So it's not just taxing tobacco, it's how those taxes are set up that really makes a difference in terms of how effective they are. So a couple of the things that we had a good sense of when we developed that WHO manual on tobacco taxation in terms of best practices in taxation was the idea that simple tax systems are going to be a lot better than complicated tax systems. And there are many governments that use actually very complicated systems where they tax the same product in many different ways, depending on some of the characteristics of the product, depending on its price, depending on other factors. But the more complicated those tax systems are, the harder they are to administer, the easier it is for tobacco users to avoid taxes, the easier it is for the industry to evade taxes. So what we really recommend is going towards simpler systems. And then another key part of this is what we call specific taxes versus what are known as ad valorem taxes. So when we think about specific taxes, these are the taxes that are levied based on some measure of quantity, so number of cigarettes or weight of tobacco. And those are going to be preferable to what we call ad valorem taxes, which are taxes that are based on price. So taxes that are levied as a percentage of price. So what we'll see is that the specific taxes actually work much better because they raise the price of all tobacco products by more on average. They reduce the differences in price between the higher priced products and the lower priced products. So it makes it more difficult for smokers, for tobacco users to switch down in response to changes in taxes and prices. So again, the recommendation here is to go towards specific tax systems. This is also something that ended up showing up in the guidelines for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Controls, Article 6, which deals with tax and price policies. So these guidelines were years in development. We finally got them through at the last conference of the parties in last October in Moscow. But it basically brings together these same basic recommendations that tax systems should be simple, they should be efficient, they should really focus on specific taxes, or if you're going to implement a mixed system, to use a system that has a minimum specific tax as part of that. So we did all this, we developed these recommendations, we developed all these guidelines basically based on what we thought made sense based on economic theory, but we had almost no empirical evidence to support that. So over the last few years, we've been working to develop that empirical evidence. So where we are now is if you look around the world, we see that systems are divided almost evenly across these different types of tax structures. So we've got about a third of countries that use a specific excise tax system. We've got about a third that use a combination of specific and ad valorem. And then we've got almost a third that use this ad valorem type of system only. And we still have some countries that don't tax tobacco products, don't use an excise tax on tobacco products. So they rely on things like import duties in countries where they have no domestic production. But what we've seen is that this has been evolving over time. So partly in response to the work that we've been doing, some of these recommendations, we've seen countries have moved away from these more complicated systems, from the ad valorem systems, towards more specific systems. And we think that there's going to be further movements in that direction going forward. In the countries where they rely on some combination of the two, they've also moved towards these more specific systems over time as well. Again, going back to the basic data, what we see is that the countries that use these types of specific tax systems are the ones that end up having higher prices on average. So it reduces those opportunities for the industry to come in with cheaper products, reduces the incentives for them to do it because they're not going to profit from it as much. So what you end up seeing is that you end up with a mix of relatively high-priced products on the market, and that's, at the end of the day, going to be what really drives tobacco use. So in the countries that use a specific system, you can see prices are highest on average. In the countries that use some combination but rely more on those specific taxes, we actually see prices next highest, and then as you move down towards more and more emphasis on these ad valorem types of taxes, you see prices going down. So in addition to that, we have countries that use more complicated systems, so what we call tiered tax systems. So these are countries where they have different taxes on the same product based on different product characteristics. So we see at this point 37 different countries around the world have this type of complicated tax system. They tax products differently based on the prices for those products, based on the characteristics of the products, so whether they have a filter or not, how long they are, what type of tobacco is being used in those products, how it's packaged. Things that are in boxes versus soft packs are going to be taxed differently in different countries. And then we have some countries where they tax based on the characteristics of the producers. So they think they're helping small businesses by taxing small producers at a lower tax rate than the big producers, which ends up causing all sorts of complications in terms of the tobacco distribution process in those countries. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to understand what the variability in these types of tax systems means when it comes to tobacco use. So starting by looking at the data that come from the ITC project. So I'm happy that Richard and his colleagues have got the ITC project going again in New Zealand. But the people that don't know about it, it's a project where we survey tobacco users in 22 countries around the world. It's a longitudinal survey where they get followed up on a regular basis, really trying to look at how the implementation of tobacco control policies influences tobacco use. So what we can do is take advantage of the variation that occurs across countries and start to look at how that plays out in terms of people's tobacco use, what products they're using, whether or not they quit over time, what products they might switch to in response to changes in taxes. So we've been taking advantage of these ITC data. We've been using data from 16 countries at this point where we have a long enough time series to really capture some of the changes that are happening. And you can see that there's a nice mix of tax systems across these countries. So for the researcher, it's great to have this sort of variability. We can start to tease out what effect the different tax systems have on some of the things that we're interested in. So you can see Bangladesh has probably one of the worst tax systems in the world, where they have an ad valorem system where they apply low rates on very cheap products and they apply high rates on very expensive products. So you end up with enormous variability in the prices of tobacco products in those countries, in Bangladesh. And then you can see all the way down to countries that have systems like what New Zealand has, where it's a uniform specific tax. So we started out by looking at just some simple descriptive information about the variability in prices within these countries, because ultimately it's how tax affects price that's going to be important. And what this shows is that there's a lot more variability. It's probably not the easiest thing to see, but what it shows is that there's a lot more variability in prices in the countries that have these more complicated tax systems. So we tend to see this greater variability, and we tend to see, again, higher prices in the countries that have relatively simple systems compared to the more complicated systems. Same sort of data. We looked at the data from the global adult tobacco surveys that have been done in a number of low and middle income countries around the world. Looked at the National Adult Tobacco Survey in the US, and basically looked at the variability in prices for the most popular brands in each of the countries. So this is showing you the average prices across countries by the top 5 brands. But I think this is the one that really shows it the clearest. So this is looking at the variability in price among those top 5 brands. And basically, again, what we see is that countries that have very simple tax systems, the US, Poland, Romania, they're at the top of what the EU recommends, basically have very little variation in price. Whereas you get into these countries that have much more complicated systems. Egypt used to have a system when they did this survey where they had 8 different tax rates that were applied based on the different prices of the products. China, a very complicated system. Bangladesh, like I talked about. The Philippines, until a few years ago, had probably the worst tax system in the world. So you see this increasing variation in price as the tax system gets more and more complicated. So we've gone a little bit further with that and tried to look at then more empirically, taking advantage of all the waves of the ITC data that were available to try to really look at what the implications of these tax systems were for price. And again, taking advantage of the fact that there are these different systems across different countries, that there have been changes in the tax systems within these different countries over time. And here's where we start to get to, I think, what makes this more relevant to tobacco control. And that's that these complicated tax systems are going to have less impact on price. And again, it's price that really matters. So what we see is that the increase in how much of the tax is specific ends up reducing that variability in price. And those really complicated systems where they have different taxes on different products, different brands, are going to have significantly higher variability in price. So what we see is that, again, prices end up higher and more stable in the countries with simpler tax systems. And then it really comes down to looking at what impact this has on tobacco use. And this is where we're still in the earlier stages of this. Again, taking advantage of the ITC data, looking at cigarette consumption as reported by smokers, trying to account for what else is happening with tobacco control policies in these countries, looking at economic conditions, looking at other factors. And what we see is that the greater emphasis that's put on that specific tax, the lower cigarette consumption is. So a long way of getting to the point that simple tax systems that focus on specific taxes raise prices, and it's those increases in prices then that drive tobacco use down. So again, we went forward with the idea that these types of simpler systems would be more effective without a lot of empirical evidence. Now we have the support for the recommendations that we've been making in terms of effectiveness in reducing tobacco use. Again, bottom line is the sort of system that we have in New Zealand is actually working relatively well, and we're trying to move other countries towards these types of systems and starting to make progress with that. I think the Philippines is probably the best example of movement in this direction. The Philippines, until a few years ago, used to have a very complicated system where they have 4 different tax rates that were applied to different brands. How the brands were classified depended on what their prices were many years before the tax was actually being implemented. So it created all these opportunities for a lot of tax avoidance there. And what they've done is to simplify their system. They've gone from those 4 tiers to 2. They've pushed the tax on the lower ones up almost to the same level as the high ones. And by 2017, they'll be at a uniform, specific, very high tax that will continue to be adjusted for inflation going forward. So again, some nice evidence of how this sort of research is informing policy change in some countries. Again, when we get down to it, we're really interested in how price affects tobacco use. So these tax systems are going to influence price. Price is what's ultimately going to affect tobacco use. We have a lot of evidence, hundreds of studies from around the world at this point that clearly show that tax and price increases lead to reductions in tobacco use. Everywhere I go, I draw graphs like this that show the associations between tax and price. This is from Hungary, where the tax has been pushed up over time, prices have come up over time, and as a result, consumption's come down. So what we estimate here is that for every 10% increase in price, we get about a 4% reduction in overall consumption in high-income countries. We see a little bit higher effect, 5 to 6% reductions in consumption in low and middle-income countries. About half the impact of price comes through its impact on smoking prevalence. So we see a lot of smokers quit smoking and fewer kids take up smoking in response to those price increases. Here's the picture from Brazil. Brazil's another country where they've done a really good job of aggressively raising taxes on tobacco products, pushing up prices, and as prices have come up, smoking prevalence has come down. And then part of the reduction in prevalence, most of the reduction in prevalence that we see is because smokers are quitting smoking. So this is some data that illustrates that from the US, where we're looking at people's interest in quitting as reflected by calls to the cessation quit lines in the US. So what we see is that if we look at the calls to the quit lines over time, you see those spikes in the quit line calls every so often, and that's almost always going to be associated with a significant tax increase. So you can see our last big tax increase in the US happened in 2009. The federal tax was increased by about 150%. And what we see is that in anticipation of that tax increase, smokers were already starting to think about quitting. They were calling the quit line. And then when the tax increase actually went into effect, you see the big spike in calls to the quit line. And then you see the same sort of effects for increases in some of the state taxes that occurred before that. So we estimate for every 10% increase in price, about 10% of smokers actually try to quit smoking in response. Smoking is a highly addictive behavior. Not everybody that tries to quit actually ends up succeeding. We estimate that for every 10 people that try to quit in response to the tax increase, about 2 end up succeeding in doing that. And that's partly reflected on this slide. So in the US, we have this situation where we have 50 different states. Every different state has its own tax system. Some have very high taxes, some have very low taxes. And what you can see in this slide is that the price basically reflects the tax. The states with the highest taxes are going to have the highest prices. And what we see is the states with high taxes, with high prices, are the states that have many more former smokers. So a lot more smokers have successfully quit in the states with the highest taxes and prices. And then one of the things that I spent a lot of my life working on is looking at kids smoking in particular. And what we see is that kids are actually the most responsive to increases in taxes and prices. So kids, when they're starting to smoke, when they're experimenting, don't really respond much to price because they're not seeing the real price of cigarettes. But it's when they start to make the transition into more regular smoking, when they start to buy their own cigarettes, they see how expensive they can be. And price has about 2 to 3 times as big an impact on kids smoking as what it has on adults. You can see in the US, we had this period in the 1990s where prices went down. Philip Morris cut its prices on Marlboro. Other companies followed. And that really explains this big rise in smoking prevalence that we saw among kids in the US. But as soon as prices started going back up, we see the reductions in youth smoking over time. And then at the end of the day, all this translates into real health effects. So this is a picture from France where the French government in the 1990s decided to get serious about tobacco control, started raising their taxes, prices start going up on the blue line. You can see on the red line, as soon as price starts going up, cigarette consumption starts coming down. And then within a few years, you start to see some of the health benefits kicking in. So what we're looking at here is early onset lung cancer, so lung cancer among young men. And you can see about 4 or 5 years after that downturn in cigarette consumption, you start to see the downturn in lung cancer deaths as well. So again, the tax increases lead to price increases, lead to reductions in smoking, and eventually to gains in public health. So again, we know a lot of this already. So higher prices, adults are going to quit, kids are not going to take it up. Former smokers are going to be deterred from starting. Those who continue are going to cut back on how much they consume. And then we're also going to see some other changes in behavior as well, including things like switching down to cheaper brands, switching to other products. So that's led us to starting to look at some new questions in the US, trying to answer the questions I always get whenever I go and talk to people about whether or not the effects of tax increases are eventually going to wear out, whether big tax increases have different effects than small tax increases, how opportunities to avoid or evade the tax affect tobacco use. So we've been focusing in some of our current research on these nonlinearities in the effects of taxes and prices on tobacco use. So again, the U.S. is a wonderful place to do this kind of research because we have huge differences in taxes and prices all across the country. So the tax at the national level is just over $1 a pack, but these are showing you some state and local taxes. Where I come from in Chicago, we have the highest taxes in the country. Taxes are $7.17 a pack when you factor in the national tax because of the high local taxes in particular. But you can see right next door in Missouri, which is not too far from Chicago, cigarette taxes at the state level are 17 cents a pack. So $6 almost difference between Chicago and right next door in Missouri. Indiana, which is 10 miles from Chicago, taxes are 99 cents a pack. So a lot of opportunities to avoid taxes if smokers just want to drive a short distance to buy cheaper cigarettes. So part of what we've been trying to do is, again, look at whether or not these sort of opportunities for tax avoidance and tax evasion end up influencing how responsive people are to prices. So this is picking up part of that. What we've tried to do here, and the colors don't come out great, is to look at what we call importing states and exporting states. So we have information on tax-paid sales in states. We have information from surveys on how much smokers report consuming. And what we want to do is to compare the reported consumption to the tax-paid sales to see where cigarettes are coming from. So not surprisingly, we see in a state like New York where cigarette taxes are relatively high, they're importing a lot of cigarettes. So yeah, my scale didn't show up on the graph. So the more gray the states are, the more that they're importing cigarettes from other states. So in New York City in particular, about half the cigarettes are estimated to come from someplace else. A lot of cigarettes that are being smuggled up from Virginia in particular. So the darker orange states are the ones that are the sources of a lot of these illegal cigarettes in the U.S. When it comes to some of the nonlinearities, we've really focused on 2 sets of data at this point. looking at the tax paid sales data, looking at the cigarette smoking behavior that's reported in surveys, controlling for these opportunities for tax avoidance and tax evasion, controlling for other tobacco control policies. Again, the policies across the states vary quite a bit. And trying to get some sense of whether or not the effects of tax and price increases are changing as tax and price levels get bigger. And what we're finding is that the price elasticity of cigarette demand increases as price increases. And I'll come back to this in a bit, but price elasticity is basically the percentage reduction in consumption that results from a 1% increase in price. So what we see is that relationship is getting bigger as price gets higher. So places where prices are higher, if you increase price by that 10%, you'll actually see a bigger reduction in consumption than what we originally thought from the work that had been done years ago. So that has real implications for how effective tax and price increases are going to be for reducing smoking, especially in places where tax and price is already at a relatively high level. We're seeing the same sort of estimates at the individual level. And here the importance of those opportunities for tax avoidance and tax evasion really become clear. So what we did here was to look at a few different sources of data on prices and looked at how the relationships that we estimated between price and some aspect of smoking behavior changed in response to the measure of price that we used. So the first one, that TBOT, is what's known as the tax burden on tobacco. These are retailer-reported prices. So it's a measure of how much retailers in a state report average cigarette prices in their stores. Then we looked at the prices that individual smokers in the states reported, and that's what's called the TUS, the Tobacco Use Supplement to the Current Population Survey measure. So what we're looking at there is the average price across the whole state, which doesn't really pick up those opportunities for tax avoidance, especially along the state borders. And then we looked at this measure at the bottom left there, which is based on local market areas. And what we see here is that we see a much stronger relationship between price when we start to look at this more local level, because it's picking up all those opportunities for avoiding the tax. It's picking up the availability of illicit cigarettes in those markets. But again, we're seeing the same sorts of relationships. We see a very strong relationship between price, and we see this increasing effect of price on tobacco use as prices get bigger. We see the same exact sort of thing when we look at consumption. The previous group looked at prevalence. So again, this has, I think, significant implications for how tax increases will work in places where tax and price is already very high. So what we see here is that we're estimating about double the effects. So if we take the average price in the US and look at places that have prices that are about twice as high on average, we see about twice as big an effect. So in the average situation, we see a 10% increase in price, reduce cigarette consumption by about 4%. At the high end, we're estimating that a 10% increase in price will reduce consumption by about 8%. So again, I think in New Zealand, this has really important implications. So taxes are already relatively high here. Prices are already relatively high here. So as you continue to increase price, you're going to start to see bigger and bigger reductions in consumption in response to those tax and price increases. Another question that always comes up, and again, I think something that has a lot of relevance to what's happening in New Zealand, is whether or not you get different responses to big tax increases that happen infrequently versus tax increases that happen steadily and are phased in over time. So what we're finding here is very, very preliminary, so I wouldn't take this to the bank at this point, but I think it's going to hold up as we get more into the data. But what we're seeing is that the big tax increases that happen less often seem to have a bigger impact in reducing consumption than a series of small increases that add up to the same amounts that's phased in over time. And I think there's a couple of things that are going on here. So I think first, the industry isn't going to be able to offset that impact, isn't going to be able to spread out the impact the same way that it can with the smaller increases. But then I think there's just this big shock value. If the price goes up by a lot all at once, that's going to have a much bigger impact on people's behavior than if it's just kind of going up steadily. They expect it's going to continue to go up steadily over time. So I think, again, it has implications. So New Zealand's done a really nice job of raising taxes, the 10% increase every year for the last several years, another one coming up in January. But I think the key thing here is that going forward, you want to think about big increases that happen perhaps less frequently than they've happened before. Big increases that happen really frequently would be a good thing, but big increases, if you have a choice between spreading them out over time or doing them all at once, I think the bigger increase all at once is going to be a bigger impact. Other tobacco product taxation, I'll just zip through this even faster than I've been going through other things. So here we don't know much about other tobacco product taxes. So it's kind of surprising. We know a lot about cigarettes. Think about hundreds of studies that have been done on cigarette demand around the world. There's probably less than 10 that have been done on other tobacco products. In the US, we actually had very little idea how different states were taxing other tobacco products. We have very little information on how people move between one product and another in response to differences in prices across those different products. So what we wanted to do was to try to really start to understand the demand for other tobacco products in the same way that we really have a lot of good information about how cigarette taxes and prices affect tobacco use. So we've done a number of different things here. One of the first things that we started with was just simply documenting what the states were doing with taxing other tobacco products. So we basically just in the last month released what we call a chart book on tobacco product taxation in the US, where we look state by state at how all the different tobacco products are being taxed across states. We have a whole series then in this chart book that describes each different state's experience, how they're taxing each of the different products, how those taxes have evolved over time. We have a whole set of fact sheets then that talk about each of the different products individually, talk about the different taxes that are being applied to those products. And then within the chart book, we have all the information again on every state's current tax system with regards to other tobacco products. So this is, I think, a little bit surprising to a lot of people. What we see is that while every state in the U.S. taxes cigarettes, there are a number of states that don't tax some other tobacco products. So most of the traditional tobacco products, cigars, little cigars, pipe tobacco, things like that, are being taxed. But there are actually states that still aren't taxing these products at all. The other key thing to take away from this is that the products that have come to market in recent years, states haven't caught up. They haven't started to tax those products either. So I don't know if these ever showed up in New Zealand. We had this whole series of dissolvable products that started to show up in the US. Things that look like little Tic Tac mints that were made out of tobacco, contain nicotine, dissolve in your mouth. The little strip type things like brush strips that you put on your tongue, it dissolves. They had toothpicks that were coated with tobacco. States didn't know what to do with those, so very few states were actually taxing those products at all. Going back to the other stuff and then e-cigarettes. We'll come back to e-cigarettes and spend a lot of time on that. But the other thing that's going on is that with regards to the tax structure issue, so coming back to what I was talking about at the beginning, states are using very different types of systems to tax these different products. So again, differences in using ad valorem systems, differences in the levels of taxes that they're applying to those tobacco products. And then a lot of states have moved away from ad valorem systems for other tobacco products and have started to move towards these specific systems. So again, we're trying to really understand how this has impacted taxes and how it's impacted prices of tobacco products. So again, just a sort of a simple summary that highlights some of the differences across states. So Pennsylvania is the one state that basically doesn't tax any other tobacco product. Then you've got some states that use ad valorem systems, very low tax rates that are like 5 or 10% of wholesale price. Other states that have very high rates that are up to 95 or 100% of wholesale price. And then other states that are using these sort of specific tax systems. So what we've been doing is to get all the information that we can get on sales of all these different tobacco products. So there's a company in the US that's actually pretty spread around the world, I think probably in New Zealand as well, AC Nielsen, where they collect all the scanner information from retailers that sell different products. So we've been able to get all the scanner data on tobacco product sales in the US over the last 10 years. You can see that these are the market areas. They collect it at the market level. In 52 different markets across the country. So we get very, very, very detailed information on the sale of every tobacco product in these different markets. So we can start to then look at how much people are paying for the products. We can start to use that information then to see how the taxes that are being applied are affecting price, and then ultimately how price affects sales. So again, coming back to the tax structure issue, We've seen a few states that have moved from these ad valorem type systems for other tobacco products towards a specific tax system. And we're seeing the same thing that we saw with cigarettes when we looked at the data across countries. So as states have moved towards a specific tax system, we've actually seen significant increases in the prices of the products that they're applying those taxes to. So here we have a couple of examples looking at little cigars, New York and Washington, where they basically made that switch, and we see the jump in price for each of those products, independent of the change in the level of the tax. We see the same sort of thing when we look at moist snuff, the most popular form of smokeless tobacco in the U.S. The switch from this ad valorem system to the specific system has led to big increases in price. So again, very consistent with trying to get states to move away from these more complicated, less effective tax systems towards the ones that are going to have their impact on price. And then when we start to look at the price effects, we're seeing that the demand for these other tobacco products tends to be much more responsive to price than cigarette demand. So I said cigarettes, you raise price by 10%, you get about a 4% reduction in consumption. With some of these products, we're seeing a 10% increase in price gets a 10% reduction in consumption or a 15% reduction in consumption. And that really happens for products where there's a lot more substitutability across products. The other thing that we're seeing is that you generally get consistent cross-price effects for products that are similar to one another. So if you raise cigarette prices but don't raise the tax on little cigars, a lot of smokers are going to switch from cigarettes to little cigars, or from cigarettes to roll your own if the tax on roll your own doesn't go up. But we don't see a lot of the same sort of things when we look at substitution between things like cigarettes and smokeless tobacco, which I think in part suggests that there are some people that are using smokeless products in places where they can't smoke as a way of maintaining their addiction. Which then kind of leads into e-cigarette demand. So I know e-cigarettes have not become a big thing in New Zealand yet, but they're a huge, rapidly growing markets in the U.S. So we've been looking at that same Nielsen data. These are just a couple of pictures. This is looking at disposable e-cigarettes, the cigalikes, the ones that look basically like cigarettes. And you can see that prices have come down really sharply over time. And associated with the reductions in price, we've seen huge increases in the sales of e-cigarettes. We've seen the same thing when it comes to the reusable products. Their prices have come down, their prices have come down over time, and the sales of those products has gone up as well. So we've been trying to look at how e-cigarette prices affects the use of e-cigarettes, and we started out by looking at those scanner data, and here we're seeing really big price effects, so much bigger than what we saw for regular cigarettes. So we estimate that a 10% increase in the prices of disposable e-cigarettes would reduce their use by about 12%. A 10% increase in the price of reusable e-cigarettes would reduce their use by about almost 20%. We also see that sales of these products were higher in states or in markets where they didn't have strong where they did have strong smoke-free policies. So part of what was going on here is that e-cigarettes are not treated under most states' smoke-free policies the same way as cigarettes are. So basically, if you're in a market where you can't smoke in a public place or in a workplace, you're still allowed to vape. So we see a lot of smokers using e-cigarettes in those markets as a way of getting around their smoke-free policy. So again, the key implication is you need to include e-cigarettes under smoke-free policies if you want to deal with that. The one thing that's been surprising to me is that we haven't seen a lot of relationships between cigarette prices and e-cigarette sales. I would have thought that if cigarette prices were higher, you would have sought a lot more e-cigarette use. But I'll get into that in just a second. But I think there's competing explanations. So at first I thought it was because we were in the early stages of these markets. I thought that it was basically because e-cigarettes were showing up in the places where there were a lot of smokers to start with. So where taxes were already low to begin with, thinking that that might have explained it. But it doesn't seem to explain it. So the way I'm seeing it is there's sort of two competing groups in this market. There's a group of people that are using e-cigarettes to try to quit. They're going to respond to the differences in prices. So if cigarette prices are high, they're going to be induced to try to quit smoking. They might switch to the e-cigarette to do that. At the same time, you've got a group of people that are using e-cigarettes to maintain their nicotine addiction, use them in places when they can't smoke. And those are the people that are viewing them basically as economic complements. So they would respond in a very different way. So there's sort of these two groups canceling one another out in the data that we have so far. Just a couple of results on all that. The other thing that I think is indicative of the potential for e-cigarettes, at least some users to be using them to quit, is what we're seeing in terms of their impact on nicotine replacement products. So we have all the data on nicotine patch sales, nicotine gum sales as well in these markets. And what we've seen is that the market that's been most affected by e-cigarettes is the pharmaceutical nicotine market. So as e-cigarettes have come into the market, a lot fewer patch sales, a lot fewer gum sales, and we're seeing a lot of substitution away from nicotine replacement products towards e-cigarettes. So again, to me, that's some evidence that at least some of the people that are using e-cigarettes are using them to try to quit. So we started to try to replicate these same sorts of analyses around the world. We've done another one that looks at some of the Western European countries in the EU, where we had the same sort of good scanner data across time. Here we can't disaggregate the market into the different types of products. But we still see significant price effects. So overall, we're seeing somewhere about 8 to 9% reductions in sales if prices were to go up by 10% in those markets. We started to try to tease some of this out at the individual level, and we're getting some, again, sort of confusing results at this point. So we did a survey, an online survey of adult tobacco users in the U.S. We ended up with about 7,500 tobacco users. We're able to link the data that we have on prices in the markets that they all live in, and we've also then linked in the policy data and things like that. But what we want to try to do is to understand the patterns of use and how price is affecting use. So you can see in this data, we don't have a lot of regular e-cigarette users. We have about 15% who have tried e-cigarettes and just over 5% who are currently using e-cigarettes. So still relatively small among adults in the U.S. Again, very different policy environments that they're all living in. But what we see is that there are some significant effects of price on ever e-cigarette use. And it's really showing up through those disposable e-cigarettes. So I think that those are the ones that are really what I would call starter products. So when people are interested in using e-cigarettes, they're thinking about it, they're going to buy the disposable, they're not going to make a big upfront investment. And it seems like it's the disposable prices that drive whether or not they ever use e-cigarettes, which is going to drive a lot of the experimentation that's happening. When it comes to the reusable prices, we're not seeing the same sorts of effects. And that's, I think, because by the time that this survey was done, people aren't really using reusable e-cigarettes. They've transferred to the tank systems, which are much more cost-effective to use. So basically, we're seeing, again, a significant number who report ever using e-cigarettes, a relatively small number that are reporting current use. We see young people are the ones that are much more likely to be using these products. And we see that experimentation, at least as I'm interpreting it, is significantly influenced by price. What we don't see is any effects on current use. So I think it's part of the market that we can't capture with the scanner data. The Nielsen system doesn't go into the vape shops that have sprung up all over the U.S., which is where people are getting the e-juice and things like that they're using in their tank systems. And then we're not finding, again, any associations between cigarette price and e-cigarette use, which is surprising to me still. The other thing that we're doing is then starting to do the same thing with some of the data that we have on kids' behavior. So one of the surveys that we've looked at kids' cigarette use and added questions last year on e-cigarette use. So we've done the same thing, started to link the market level price data to the kids' e-cigarette use. And here we're seeing really, really big effects of price. And at some level, they're sort of unbelievably big, but they're 3 or 4 times bigger than what we saw for cigarettes. But again, it suggests to me that kids are going to be very responsive to the prices for e-cigarettes. So what we're waiting to do is to add the latest year of data in the next couple of months so that we can update the analysis and see what's happening there. So this all brings me back to sort of what I really focus on, which is tax. So in the U.S., governments have become really interested in trying to figure out how to tax e-cigarettes, whether they should tax e-cigarettes or not. So what we're trying to do is to look at whether or not e-cigarettes would be responsive to those kind of taxes and what types of taxes, going back to the tax structure issues, would work the best in terms of influencing e-cigarette use. We're at a point where, again, this research is all in its infancy. We don't have all the data that we need. We're trying to figure out how to collect the data that we need. And we're making some progress on this. We have a new survey in the field, the same sort of online survey that we did a couple years ago, where we're collecting a lot more information about what types of products people are using, where they're buying it, what they're paying for it, and things like that, so that we can advance this work a little bit. So again, that brings me back around to how we should tax these products. So there's big debates in the public health community. I think everybody's probably aware of that, over whether e-cigarettes are a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure where everybody comes down. How many people think e-cigarettes have potential to improve public health? A few, all right. How many think they're terrible, the worst thing since cigarettes? A few, all right. So, and then there's a bunch of people apparently in the middle that didn't raise their hand to either one. I'm somewhere in the middle. So, I think that there is some real potential for e-cigarettes to have a positive public health impact. Combustible cigarettes are the cause of almost all the death and disease that comes from tobacco use. E-cigarettes appear to be significantly reduced risk. They're not harmless by any means, but they seem to be significantly reduced risk. If we could get regular smokers to switch to e-cigarettes, that would have a positive public health impact. The key thing, though, is to keep kids from taking them up. So in the U.S., the problem is that we see e-cigarette use is highest among young people. We see way more kids using e-cigarettes now than we see using regular cigarettes. And the concern here is that kids are going to realize that these are not the most efficient way of getting their nicotine. They're going to move on and become smokers, and then that's going to lead to a lot more smoking, worse public health outcomes than what we would have otherwise. Governments are really interested because they think revenues are going down from tobacco use, especially e-cigarettes, maybe driving revenues down faster. So they want to try to figure out how to tax these products to get some revenue. In the U.S., there are a handful of places that have adopted taxes on e-cigarettes. Minnesota was the first one to do it. North Carolina's just went into effect a couple months ago. Kansas is going to start doing it next summer. Lots of other states are talking about doing it. A couple of communities have done this. And in Chicago, we just proposed a tax a couple of weeks ago. Minnesota is taxing them like other tobacco products. This was not something the public health community had anything to do with. The Department of Revenue decided that e-cigarettes fit their definition of a tobacco product because they contain nicotine derived from tobacco. So they just went ahead and decided they're going to tax them like other tobacco products. Their other tobacco product tax is set to be equivalent to cigarette taxes, so 95% of price. And this is just some of the language that talked about this in their decision, their revenue memo that talked about doing this. So Minnesota taxes based on the value of the e-juice. So going back to all those tax structure issues that I led off with, they're applying an ad valorem tax, and they apply it to any product that has any of the juice in it. So they tax disposable cigarettes based on the price of the disposable cigarettes. So big tax on disposable cigarettes. They wouldn't tax the device at all if it didn't have the juice. So the tank systems, the devices are not being taxed. They would only tax the juice there then. It's a complicated distribution system. It's not like cigarettes where it goes from the manufacturer to the wholesaler to the retailers. All the taxes are collected at the wholesale level. Here, a lot of the product goes straight to the retailers. So it gets a lot more complicated to try to figure out how to collect that tax. They're trying to collect it at both levels. They're pretty actively engaged in enforcing the taxes there. North Carolina is the opposite. North Carolina has adopted what we call the RJ Reynolds version of an e-cigarette tax, which is the one that the tobacco company is pushing. It's a very, very, very low tax, so they're taxing the juice. They're taxing it at 5 cents per milliliter. They're taxing only the solutions that contain any nicotine. And again, they're trying to figure out how to collect this tax because they don't have, again, the same sort of the traditional distribution system. So they're trying to go after the wholesalers, but they're mainly focusing on the retailers at this point. But they're not being as aggressive. Right now, they're basically in the process of just educating people about the fact that they should be paying this tax if they're selling these products. Kansas is somewhere in between. Kansas has adopted a similar specific tax that's based on the juice. So in their case, it's going to be 20 cents per milliliter. And their tax is going to go into effect next year. And they actually passed this tax in combination with an increase in cigarette taxes. which is what I think is actually the right thing to do. But they're delaying implementation for a year because they're not sure how they're going to actually do it at this point. Chicago, I think, is probably closest to what I'm thinking is the right way to do this. Chicago is using a combination of taxes, so they're taxing the devices and they're taxing the juice. They have a relatively, it seems like a small tax, $1.25 on the devices, but it hits the disposable products the hardest because those are the lowest price, and it doesn't really have much of an impact on those tank systems. And I think the key thing here is to try to incentivize people to make the investment in the tank systems. Costs a little bit more upfront, a lot less to use in the long run. But it seems like the people that are using those systems are the ones that are most committed to quitting. That's why they've made those investments. And that's why I think it makes sense to try to incentivize people to move towards those systems. Don't use these disposable e-cigarettes, which again seem to be the starter products for kids. It seem to be the ones that are most used by the dual users. So they're going to tax the device and they're going to tax the e-juice that goes into the device. If you look around the world, there's actually very, very few places that are taxing e-cigarettes. Togo, of all places, is one of the few that's doing it. They did it basically for the same reason that Minnesota did, because it fit their definition of a tobacco product. Korea actually has a relatively high tax on the juice, much higher than any of what we've seen in the US. Italy tried to impose a tax. They passed a tax in 2013, went into effect in 2014, and their e-cigarette market went way down. So everywhere else we're seeing e-cigarette use rising exponentially. In Italy, there was more than a 50% drop in the number of people using e-cigarettes. There was over almost a 40% drop in sales. The one thing that they are subject to is the value-added tax in a lot of countries, although there are countries that have exempted at least some of the products from their value-added tax when they're being described as pharmaceutical devices. So the UK is, for example, exempted, I think, one product that's been approved at this point. Again, the definitions are really important. If you define tobacco products in a broad enough way that counts any product that contains nicotine derived from tobacco, then you can go ahead and implement an e-cigarette tax currently. You don't have to do anything special to do that. There are a number of other states that have taken this other approach, though, where they're defining e-cigarettes specifically in their own category and applying specific taxes to those. So again, this is an area where I'm struggling to figure out exactly what to recommend, but I think it's becoming clearer as we start to see more of what's happening with the experiences in places that have done this. So we go back to what I started out at the beginning with, which is how do you tax them? So I've come around to the idea that a specific tax on the juice itself, along with that specific tax on the device, makes the most sense. That's the one that's going to disincentivize the experimental use the most. It's the one that's going to incentivize the regular use the most. Again, there are some advantages and disadvantages of the different types of tax systems. Another question that comes up is whether or not to tax based on nicotine content. Sounds like a good idea at first, but I think the more you think about it, what you want to do is encourage users to substitute products that are really going to be good substitutes for cigarettes. So if you start to tax the ones that have more nicotine in them, the ones that are going to be more readily substitutable for cigarettes, that's going to discourage people from making that substitution. So I think it makes sense to have the tax on the products that contain nicotine. Don't tax the ones that don't have any nicotine, but then don't put higher taxes on the ones that have more nicotine content. And then the last issue is how do you collect these taxes? And this is a big challenge in the US because, like I said, they don't go through traditional distribution chains. I think the key thing is to focus on collecting the tax from the retailers. And the key thing then is to license everybody that sells these products, which is not being done anywhere in the world as far as I'm aware of at this point. So anybody can open up a vape shop on the corner. They don't need a license to do that. But if you're going to really try to collect the taxes effectively, you need to know who's selling them. So you need to license and control distribution as well. And then the last part of this gets into what tax to apply. So again, you sort of have, I think, a few different basic strategies here. One is to apply very low taxes or no taxes, kind of what North Carolina is doing, or by default what most of the rest of the country is doing in the US. The rationale for this is that it's going to maximize the incentives for adults to switch to them by keeping that price differential between cigarettes and e-cigarettes as big as possible. But the big consequence, I think, here is that it really does keep prices low. A lot of kids are going to start to experiment with them, take up e-cigarettes, and who knows what will happen as a result of that. It also doesn't really encourage the sort of substitution that I think is going to be important, but instead encourages a lot of dual use. The opposite approach is to do what Minnesota's doing them, tax them at high levels, tax them like you tax other tobacco products, tax them like you tax cigarettes. That's going to be effective in keeping kids from taking up e-cigarette use. But the problem is it's going to discourage then smokers who continue to smoke from substituting to e-cigarettes. So you're not going to see the same potential health benefits there. So where I've come down is that I think the key thing is to do both. Raise your cigarette taxes at the same time as you implement an e-cigarette tax. Raising the cigarette tax is going to keep kids from smoking. It's going to encourage a lot more adults to quit. Raising the e-cigarette tax is going to discourage kids from taking up e-cigarette use. But at the same time, maintaining some differential between e-cigarettes and cigarettes is going to encourage adults who can't quit smoking, who are heavily addicted, to make that switch to e-cigarettes. So it seems like this is what Kansas tried to do. They, I don't think, did it as well as they could by delaying the implementation of the e-cigarette tax. But it seems like they're going in the right direction. And I think this is really the right direction as far as Chicago is going. This is just a quick snapshot of what we actually get. So we're not getting a lot of the data in this market. So the market in the U.S. is estimated at about $3.5 billion US at this point. We pick up about 20% of the market in the data that we're working with, which makes it challenging. So when I go and talk to governments and they ask me how much revenue they can get from e-cigarettes, I have to try to extrapolate from that 20% to the rest of the market. But I'm an economist. I make a lot of assumptions. That doesn't stop me from coming up with some estimates. So we've been working on this. I've been working with a couple of states, California and Illinois at this point, trying to figure out what the revenue generating potential of these e-cigarette taxes are. Again, looking at the substitution between cigarettes and e-cigarettes, trying to extrapolate from what we know about the part of the market that we are measuring to what would happen in the rest of the markets. And we estimate that these, they have some potential for generating some real revenues, but when it comes right down to it, nowhere near as much as what cigarette tax increases do. So I've been talking with California. California is going to be putting another tax increase on their ballots this coming year. Almost all tax increases in California have to be approved by voters. And they're going to be proposing to raise the cigarette tax by $2 a pack. If they do that, they'll generate almost $1 billion in tax revenue, so real money. If they were to impose an e-cigarette tax that was equivalent to the cigarette tax that they're proposing, they get about $21 million. So e-cigarette use is still pretty small. It's not going to be a big revenue generator for governments at this point in time. Not relevant to, or not compared to cigarette taxes. So again, this is where I come down. Tax e-cigarettes at a high enough rate to really discourage kids' use, at the same time as you raise the rates on the most harmful products, the ones that are accountable for most of the death and disease from tobacco use, in order to try to get adults to both quit, and if they can't quit, then to substitute towards a less harmful product. And then again, I always come back to the idea that whenever you do this, the revenue that's being generated from these taxes should be put back into tobacco control efforts, should be put back into programs that are going to help adults quit. They're going to keep kids from taking up tobacco use. So the last few minutes, a couple of implications for New Zealand, I think. New Zealand's doing great on a lot of things. New Zealand has this recommended approach, best practices for tobacco taxes, has a high uniform specific tax, taxes comparable products in the same way. The taxes regularly increase so inflation doesn't erode the value over time. And you have had these periodic increases in taxes over time. Coming back to all the tax structure issues, because you have this high specific tax, there is relatively little variation in price across different brands in the market. So the cheap brands are 90% of the price of the premium brands, which again reduces opportunities for people to switch to cheaper brands in response to tax and price increases. One of the things that we emphasize is the importance of increasing tax regularly so to reduce affordability. So the tax and price are going up faster than income. Again, New Zealand's doing great on this measure. If you look at what's happened over the last several years, you see big reductions in affordability because of the big increases in taxes that have occurred. So it all comes down. You can see it on the same picture I drove for every place I go. I had to draw them for New Zealand as well. As prices have gone up in New Zealand over time, you see the reductions in cigarette consumption. But you do see a couple of times when price wasn't going up because there weren't tax increases. And you can see that when that happened, you started to see the stop in the decline in consumption. So again, it just emphasizes the importance of regular tax increases. You can't just assume that things are going to continue to go down in the absence of those tax increases. Same sort of impact on prevalence. When prices have gone up, prevalence has really come down. When prices aren't going up, you don't see the same sort of big declines in prevalence. The other thing I think that's going to be important, so you have one more tax increase scheduled. I think it's going to be important to continue to raise taxes going forward. And again, I come back to this idea that maybe you don't do it every year at 10%. If you can get bigger increases, the 20% a year would be a good thing. But you might think about going for 50% every 2 or 3 years instead of these more gradual increases that get phased in over time. That's going to, again, I think have a bigger impact. And because of what we're seeing in terms of the levels of tax and price already in the country, those sort of big tax increases will have even bigger effects than they've had in the past. Because of this increasing price elasticity, increasing response to price as tax and price levels are higher. Using the revenues is a key thing. I know no finance minister likes to talk about earmarking or dedicating revenues from any tax to specific programs, but I think there's a real argument to be made when it comes to tobacco taxes. Think about them as a user fee. Think about them as helping to cover the healthcare costs that are being caused by tobacco use. So put the money from the tobacco taxes back into tobacco control efforts. And I think there's a couple of key things that need to be done here. So the first thing is really to support cessation programs for smokers who are going to be hit by those tax increases. So when you push tax up, low-income smokers are going to want to quit. They're going to be the most responsive to those increases in taxes and prices. They typically have the least access to cessation services, cessation support. So putting the money back into programs that are specifically targeting the lowest socioeconomic populations, Maori population, where smoking rates are very high, is going to be really important in helping to get added benefits in terms of bigger reductions in tobacco use. And then the other thing we know is that people like tobacco tax increases when the tax revenues go back into tobacco control efforts. So we see it in almost every public opinion poll. You actually see a majority of smokers in most places support big tax increases when they know that the money is going to go back into helping smokers quit and preventing kids from taking up the addiction that they wish they had never started. And then 2 more things. The next thing is to do this as part of a comprehensive package of tobacco control measures. We know that tax increases are reinforced by other tobacco control policies. Other tobacco control policies are reinforced by tax increases. So when you implement a tax increase, that's not the only thing that needs to be done. Push forward with other things. And plain packaging is something I've become a big fan of. I've been working with Australia and the UK the past few years. And I think plain packaging is a good thing to move forward with in New Zealand. It's the last real form of marketing that tobacco companies have available to them. And then this is the one that's probably the most controversial. Think about a harm reduction approach. E-cigarettes that contain nicotine are not allowed in New Zealand, not allowed to be sold in New Zealand at this point. You might think about that strategy I was talking about in terms of thinking about e-cigarettes as a way of helping smokers who can't quit entirely switch to something that's going to be a lot less harmful. And again, I think there's good ways to do this. You can't do what we're doing in the US where they're allowed to be sold everywhere. It doesn't matter. You don't have to have a license. You can market them as aggressively as you want. I think the key thing here is to do that in combination with strong controls over their sales. So the sort of tax system that I was talking about, including e-cigarettes and the smoke-free policy, so you can't vape in places that you can't smoke, making sure that kids don't have access to them, and don't allow the sort of marketing that we see happening in the US where they're really aggressively being marketed, especially to young people. So again, if that was a whirlwind tour of a lot of what we're doing, not everything that we're doing, but a good part of it. If you're interested in more, I always have to plug our Tobacconomics program. So this is our tobacco economics research program. We created about a year ago the Tobacconomics brand. We have a website. You can follow us on Twitter. And then I'm happy to answer any questions by email, and then we have a chance to talk now. So thank you.